It was now 1:40 a.m., day one of the invasion, as the suppression of enemy air defense operations had been ongoing in the western side of the installation between the elements of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade fighting the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, rapidly advancing, smashing their way into the installation, surrounding and destroying these units, in addition to the artillery having smashed all of the vehicles of the 3rd of the 2nd, causing them to flee the area and then proceed to attempt a counterattack to break out their fellow soldiers of the 4th of the 3rd and the headquarters of Headquarters Brigade, encapsulating the command elements and other administrative elements over the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade. This was hastily parried and destroyed by forces of the 1 Armored Battalion of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade and its Mechanized Infantry Battalion's forces in the local area to the east of the pocket they'd created by surrounding the aforementioned forces as shown. Over on the furthest easternmost portion of the map, as the air power was now just starting to arrive in the area by 1:40, as combat engineer battalions comprising the 77th Combat Engineering Brigade smashed their way into the post on the eastern side to assault and destroy a major artillery force in the form of the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, having its multiple different rocket-oriented artillery battalions consisting of M270 MLRSs and HIMARS as it related to their 1st of the 14th. At the time these forces were being engaged, one of the companies of the 3rd of the 13th had already been struck and destroyed by rocket artillery, with some of its surviving remaining rocket artillery systems in the form of the M270 MLRSs having tried to flee down a ridge, only themselves to then be engaged and destroyed by the combat engineers and their J-11 air support, as well as their CH-901 support fired from the headquarters battalion over the whole 77th Combat Engineering Brigade, armed with heat warheads or high explosive anti-tank. One single battalion on the very end of their line of forces on the easternmost end was tasked with clearing a somewhat fortified area consisting of pre-prepared firing positions for brigade and battalion level fire drills for the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, in conjunction with the guest forces likewise at Fort Sill to train on large exercises with their cohorts of the 75th Field Artillery Brigade. The 3rd of the 13th had its 2 remaining batteries of M270 MLRSs just adjacent to the southwest corner airfield of Fort Sill, in addition to its headquarters of Headquarters Battery, as the entire battalion was comprised of 3 different company-sized elements or batteries, being it was an artillery force, and each battery possessed 9 M270 MLRS systems. As these forces were already dug in pre-prepared firing positions, prepared long ago for such types of drills on the installation, this area was likewise as the mock-up FOB, which was currently in use for the training by the 100th Brigade Support Battalion of the 75th, were likewise in fortified areas, and the engineers were perfect for attacking the FOB that was being used by this Brigade Support Battalion, in addition to the earthworks of the firing positions, sandbag machine gun emplacements, and foxholes as machine gun emplacements. With the Americans having interlocking fields of fire, this wouldn't necessarily be a complete cakewalk insofar as the saying goes, although the combat engineers were the ideal force to carry out an assault against strong points such as these, as their engineering vehicles, such as the GPZ-111As, had rocket-fired line-clearing charges of high explosive which could detonate a line through a minefield in order for vehicles to pass safely through. But these high explosive plastic explosives that comprise the line charge fired by the rocket could also be used against enemy fortifications. In addition to this, these combat engineers, of course, also possessed demolition, quad-legged robots that could plant C4 charges, as well as armed robots with heavy machine guns of the same type, the quad-legged robots. And each company of these battalions possessed 5 of each type, 5 demolition robots and 5 armed robots with 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns as a mobile fire support platform for their troops on the ground. In addition, of course, to their Type 08 infantry fighting vehicle and armor personnel carrier types, these being wheeled vehicles, which were 4x2, as in these were eight wheeled vehicles. As this battalion had smashed its way into the installation, on the map consisting of the southwest corner airfield, there was varied terrain features throughout the area, such as hills, including taller hills as elevation rose in some areas higher than in others, and also scattered woodlands in this area. While the land around the airstrip immediately around it was particularly flat, there were small clumps of wooded areas from which there could be some obstruction to the sight of the American forces, as these forces, having had smashed their way in, snuck up to the unaware Americans with relative ease until they encountered their first machine gun nest, which a line charge had been fired at it to simply just annihilate it right off the bat, as there were the pre-prepared firing positions for the 2 batteries of M270 MLRS systems, which were already in place due to their training that they were undertaking within the scope of these larger drills that included the guest units training with them that had come from Fort Bliss down in El Paso, where another battle was occurring exactly at the same time. The terrain was used to the best advantage, as this particular segment of the much larger battle occurring only shows 2 PLA engineering companies of the whole engineering battalion, as in each of these comprised of approximately 140 soldiers each company, with the headquarters company moving in off the map just to their south behind their advance, while the other combat companies, being 5 additional combat companies, were continuing to move off map to the east and heading north, while these companies engaged the Americans in front of them, as these 2 companies were given the sole objective of defeating all armed resistance immediately within the vicinity of the airfield, and were to capture and hold the airfield for future operations, insofar as heli-borne operations or those including logistical resupply via cargo aircraft, as this was very important. as this airfield was to be captured and secured as much intact as possible, also was the main airfield, the Henry Army Airfield in the main post, which was to be captured and held by two PLA Special Operations battalions of their 77th Special Operations Brigade, carried in by the two transportation helicopter brigades, or battalions rather, of their 77th Aviation Brigade of the 77th PLA Group Army. As early on, a line charge had been fired by this company and this platoon of this larger company from its armored engineering vehicle in the form of the GPZ-111A, having fired the line charge, completely obliterating this sandbagged machine gun emplacement with a full squad of 8 American troops, as per their average squad sizes. And there was a patrolling squad on this hill that was a roving patrol established by the firing battery here of these M270 MLRS forces of the 3rd of the 13th, which was a battalion of MLRS elements within the 75th Field Artillery Brigade as a larger entity. As they reached the point where they initiated this battle, as their quadcopter reconnaissance drones had mapped the area in front of them, along with the higher flying WZ-7 and CH-4A, who were orbiting the entire battle space within this particular AO, or battle space. Constant data, again, was being processed by the very advanced Chinese artificial intelligence system, which was managing all the fluid real-time battlefield data in order to update commanders literally by the second on all of the changing battlefield conditions, while processing a whole different array of all types of information, everything ranging from different units and their capabilities and their sizes to the terrain features and how best to deploy troops, all passed down in a matter of seconds, which was vital in not only pinpointing enemy positions in order to better destroy them, but also cut down even on friendly fire incidents between the different forces operating all in the same area. And this program of artificial intelligence even made it extremely simple for the different coalition member nations to better communicate, as Russian and Chinese was instantly translated and updated each nation's combat data links accordingly in order to call in for airstrikes by the Chinese of Russian assets, or even in other battles for Russians to call in Chinese airstrikes and other types of support and assistance. As they reached this battlefield, it was just about to go on 2 o'clock or 2 a.m., which would be 2 hours into the whole invasion, although only 20 minutes after all of these forces had arrayed themselves around the installation in the city of Lawton for the battle, as they took some time to get into position, to set up artillery forces, and to prepare for their assault and await their aviation fixed-wing assets of the PLAAF and VVS, or the Russian Air Force, accordingly. And the PLAAF being, of course, the Chinese Air Force, as both were operating combat aircraft within this specific battle. The Chinese, their H-6K Heavy Strategic Bomber Squadron, 7 of which participating in this battle, while 1 had participated in the battle to the south of the Shepherd Air Force Base. As initially it was to be 2, 1 was diverted and sent instead to support operations in the Fort Sill Lawton area, as it was not needed due to Shepherd had fallen exceedingly fast to the 77th Special Operations Brigade, who very soon was about to drive up and fly up along the I-44 corridor with its headquarters battalion driving in, who operated the entire brigade's vehicles, driving in 2 regular battalions of operators and their heavy weapons battalion, while the 2 transportation helicopter battalions of the 77th Aviation Brigade would fly in the additional 4 battalions, dropping 2 off at the Lawton Fort Sill Regional Airport in the city of Lawton, and 2 more, which would actually be dropped off first at the Henry Army Airfield in order to hold it and seize it. That would come a bit later, between the hours of 2:30 and 3:30, or hour rather. And as this fighting was occurring, 2 airport buildings had been fortified with a sandbag machine gun emplacement just to the southeast of one of the buildings, with a foxhole dug alongside of the road which went past these buildings here, with interlocking fields of fire between the machine gun and the foxhole from here, as they could both fire this way and this way, from here all the way out to here, giving them a nice arc of fire where they could both fire on the same targets, although they could fire independently of one another. Being able to have interlocking fields of fire definitely helped their defensive situation overall. And although the Americans lost all of their ISR assets in the very first minutes of the invasion, having all their military satellites downed by hard-kill anti-satellite weapons such as the S-500, the Dongnang 2s and 3s, as well as others, and the tandem cyber strike, these forces here, at least for a little while, had been able to use their radios until the H-6Ks, 2 of which out of the whole bomber squadron assigned to this area, had been equipped with the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods, and were now jamming radios and radars and other redundant systems that were not either directly connected to the internet and therefore unhackable, or not dependent upon satellites for any of their operations, such as the targeting and tracking radars of the Patriot missile systems and the radio sets utilized by American ground forces. And the military networks used by the American ground forces were all completely taken down by the cyber attack, and the anti-satellite attack completely took away not just their ISR assets, but their GPS, which many of their weapon systems depended on, including their M270 MLRS, which fired GPS-guided rockets. As this battle unfolded, one platoon in particular was assigned with outflanking the airport buildings by coming in from the southeast, while another platoon of this company of 3 combat platoons with its headquarters platoon off map, while this platoon in the middle of this company of its 3 combat platoons was assigned with going directly up the middle and assaulting between these 2 buildings while giving support fire to their own additional sections assigned to clearing these buildings and assaulting this area in between. While their 3rd combat platoon here was assigned with getting into a holding position right here in order to cover the road that went from the north and went 2 different ways in a fork, going southwest before heading west and going to the slight southeast towards the end of the installation by its outer fencing perimeter, its perimeter fencing. As this was going on, this original machine gun nest, this sandbag emplacement for a machine gun squad here, a squad with a light or general purpose machine gun that had been destroyed by the line charge, had an interlocking field of fire with this machine gun nest here, as both could cover this way and this one could cover this way, in addition to what there was originally a machine gun nest just over the side of this hill by fortifications such as these pre-prepared berms that these M270 MLRSs had been firing behind, which this sandbag emplacement now destroyed by this heavy carpet munitioning of this heavy dropping of ordnance by this H-6K strategic bomber aircraft, of which 2 were over the area, although 1, as they were entering at 140, 1 was further off the map, covering the guest units of the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade, who was training in the area as well with these elements of the 75th. It's 3rd of the 13th. Their other firing battery that had been caught up in the fighting going on with the rest of the 75th and the 2 batteries of the 1st of the 79th, which were training elements coordinating their initial training before the invasion, they had been trying to flee when the first 122 millimeter rocket strikes came in from the 77th Field Artillery Brigade of the 77th Group Army hitting here, and they had all been destroyed by this point as they fled down the ridge as shown in the previous battle and were decimated by a combination of different firepower. Within this area, this outer roving patrol had been eliminated right off the bat, along with this machine gun nest destroyed by the line charge. And these forces on this hill, this one squad, destroyed by vehicle-based fire from 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, as well as the infantry fighting vehicle of this particular platoon here having fired its Gatling 35mm autocannon, simply blasting these forces to pieces, along with the 12.7mm fire from the other vehicles, including the armored engineering vehicle and one of their 4-legged robots having had fired in this area. This had already occurred right as the heavy strategic bomber just began to drop its ordnance right about here, blasting this area, destroying, completely flattening, and obliterating the platoon here that was here of 3 M270 MLRS systems, along with its support vehicles and its command vehicle, FDC. And as that was going on, this heavy strategic aircraft was to continue flying up here and dropping more munitions and flattening the rest of this particular battery, which had 3 here, and then 3 off the map just to the north of this particular map segment. And as that was even happening, multiple other things throughout this whole map were going on simultaneously, including the landing of this DF-15B tactical ballistic missile, landing on the headquarters platoon who had set up tents for the training exercise in this area, along with other vehicles from the other headquarters platoon of this other battery that had a firing position here with earthworks in the form of berms, and another one here, and another one even further to the slight northeast off the map. And they were hit by 2 Su-35 strike aircraft flying down, strafing the area as these forces ran, many abandoning their vehicles, as was being done over here, as this H-6K was now laying waste to this enormous area and about to approach them rapidly. For many, it would be too late, as these encapsulated arrows show, as this aircraft is flying extremely fast, dropping its payload from thousands of feet in the air, many thousands of feet. And these aircraft, having swooped down to strafe, fired their laser-guided S-25 air-to-ground rockets, which all in all had a roughly just over 3-mile range, 3.1 miles or so, and were fired at this position here with its vehicles behind the earthwork berm, as well as dropping 2 FAB 500s, which were 500 kilograms, as in they were just over 1,000-pound munitions, essentially, so they're roughly 1,000 pounds, dropping 2 apiece per aircraft onto these forces right here, totally decimating them. As the heat warhead equipped CH-901 loitering munitions had been fired by the headquarters battalion, which for its part, in the very opening moves of the battle, had fended off an attack by armed reactionary civilians from the countryside who had immediately banded together upon all of the loss of the grid and telecom and internet and all the opening of the fire, and had tried to fight the headquarters platoon of the Combat Engineering Brigade, only to be fended off and having to flee to the south. And the headquarters battalion's drone sections dedicated to firing the 48-tubed TEL-like systems that fired these loitering munitions had fired a few salvos of 48 apiece, 48 headed toward this battle between their combat battalions and the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, and another 48 fired into this area with this concentration of units here, being the Divisional Artillery Brigade of the 1st Armored Division and its subunits comprising it as a whole unit, as well as the most of the elements of the 3rd of the 13th adjacent to the airfield, the southwest corner airfield. And these loitering munitions, armed with their heat warheads, began to attack vehicles as they were set on AI targeting mode, many flying further north to hit other vehicles, while those that stayed in the area often didn't find any immediate vehicle targets due to the airstrikes eliminating them, as well as the heavy strategic air raid wiping out an entire battery going up the line, causing these troops here, as these first payloads were landing, these troops abandoned their position, which was another foxhole with a machine gun nest in it, and they ran out into the open in sheer panic, but were lit up by vehicle-based fire as well as a CH-901, and although it was armed with heat warheads and specifically intended on being used against vehicles, its AI targeting mode caused it to strike this group, and the heat warhead eliminated them in conjunction with the ground-based firepower, which at this point was extremely intense, as both sides were exchanging machine gun fire and small arms fire against each other, with the combat engineers having had dismounted their vehicles to perform a rolling shield tactical maneuver in double columns, with one doing a double column rolling shield on the left side of this armor personnel carrier, another one behind this vehicle, this armored engineering vehicle, this GPZ-111A, having its squad dismount behind it, leaving its gunner and driver in each of these vehicles, and this squad dismounted behind this APC and this one behind this APC, as was the case over here as well. Also, at the opening moves of this entire battle, all of these events occurring simultaneously or near so, this company hadn't even been fully covered as of yet, but first, we'll discuss what occurred here with this demolition robot and this armed robot attempting to cover it as it approached this building, armed with its C4 charges. This robot moved up while laying down heavy fire against this MRAP and this machine gun nest, while it in turn was taking heavy fire along with these vehicles taking fire from these forces, their interlocking fields of fire, firing both at these vehicles together and at this armed robot as it approached, but upon it arriving to this point was out of the field of fire of this machine gun nest. Otherwise, it was possible for friendly fire, although the fire was instead fully vectored from the machine gun nest onto the quad-legged robot, which destroyed it. Although while that happened, this robot was able to get in very close, and these forces fired at it while it was here, but then it moved to the building and planted its charges. And by the time it finished planting the charges, it was so badly damaged that it was no longer useful, although the charges were planted and detonated by the engineers at the same exact time as this C4 demolition robot of this platoon had followed this armored personnel carrier right here as it was moving up at the same time as all of this was going on. These forces were moving to this point right here before stopping and continuing to lay down fire with the troops relatively safe behind the vehicles as their armed robot moved up as well and laid down heavy fire on the forces firing out of this building. Within the buildings, there were 30 headquarters troops and 20 headquarters troops of one of the two headquarters headquarters platoons of the two different firing companies in the area. And these forces were firing their light machine guns, their M249s, which were the squad automatic weapons, as well as their M16A4 standard rifles, firing them out of these buildings and at the robot as it approached. And it was laying down heavy fire in return against the building, whereby by the time this armor personnel carrier on the very end of this platoon reached here, its demolition robot exited the area from behind the vehicle as it was following behind the vehicle as so. It ran from behind the vehicle, and as this robot was providing it a measure of fire support, it got in, planted its charges, and went back as this double-sided arrow indicates. They planted the charges and came back to the armor personnel carrier back behind it. And that happened at the same time that this one that was severely damaged and now destroyed had already planted its charges but was unable to escape before being destroyed. And the engineers set off their charges and blew this entire building up. This building was gone. And by that time, as was also the MRAP, whose turret gunner was busy trying to fire at these vehicles who were firing back at it, which the MRAP was mounted by an M2 50 caliber heavy machine gun, which was firing back and forth with these armor personnel carriers armed with 12.7 millimeter machine guns, or the Chinese equivalent of a 50 cal. The back and forth fire was extremely intense, and the vehicles saved the lives of their troops who were behind them, and their quadcopter reconnaissance drones had fixed all the enemy positions that remained as this campsite established by the headquarters platoon of this battery had already been hit and destroyed by a tactical ballistic missile, with the airstrikes coming down and destroying much of this battery right here, and they would continue to put down fire on the remains of it further to the northeast off the map. And these forces abandoning their positions to be hit by a CH-901A in conjunction with the ground fire from these forces here, the quadcopter recon drones were now observing all of the devastation occurring. And as these forces had early on, these two squads that were taking some of the fire that was being exchanged, had ran into this building here and between the buildings here, and were now being engaged by these forces here who had already stopped here when the robot set its charges and were now moving ahead. The vehicles were, as they had destroyed this MRAP completely, which was now a smoking hulk of metal just sitting there between the demolished building and this building that was taking heavy fire, as indicated by these red lines on the sides of it, this side and this side. Although this one being completely surrounded indicates it was destroyed, along with the number completely surrounded in red. And as the fire was being exchanged back and forth, the demolished MRAP sitting there, these forces fired AT-4 man-portable, shoulder-fired, recoilless shell systems at the vehicles, doing severe damage to the armor personnel carrier that was here at the time and had moved here, before its troops from behind it in their rolling shield maneuver got out from behind and attacked these infantry troops here. Well, they were artillerymen, but acting as foot infantry essentially. And they exchanged fire back and forth. These guys from right beside their armor personnel carrier that was now fairly well damaged. And they ended up eliminating them with their turret gunner on their APC laying down heavy fire. And as that was going on, this APC had moved here, and the troops behind it ran to storm the building, along with this armored engineering vehicle coming up the center, with its troops coming out from behind it and storming this building. As you can see, these two arrows are capped in green, meaning that they were taking fire as they entered this building. So they were under fire. They were being at least fired upon while they were entering the building. That didn't mean they were necessarily hit, it just meant that they were being engaged. And they broke in through windows and entered the building and began clearing it room by room of all 20 of these troops, while their vehicles held positions outside. And their armed robot ended up being destroyed by the time it reached this point here, right before the demolition, because these troops in here had been firing at it, as this is totally encapsulated by green, as this one was mentioned already have been destroyed as well, along with this demolition bot. The other demolition robot had survived and made it back behind the safety of the armor personnel carrier coming up on this end of this platoon here, attacking this area. And there were two parked LMTV trucks behind this building that was now being cleared by these two dismounted squads of combat engineers, while this infantry fighting vehicle and this APC here held their positions smack dab in the middle of the airfield, with the two dismounted squads and their rolling shield coming up beside both vehicles to aid their vehicles in firing at any remaining dismounted forces outside of the building, which a few tried to fire upon their vehicles but were cut down, including this MRAP right here that was eventually destroyed, having fired its turret machine gun at the infantry fighting vehicle, only to be hit by the infantry fighting vehicle's single HJ-73C anti-tank missile, which was fired and hit the MRAP, destroying it. This MRAP was destroyed as well by the 35mm Gatling gun that tore it apart, in conjunction, of course, with all of the heavy machine gun fire, and including from this armed robot, as this platoon had moved into position here, again as a holding position to guard the roads, and this armed robot moved up the runway, but eventually had been destroyed as these MRAPs had laid down substantial heavy machine gun fire on it, eliminating it. So by this point, the combat engineers had lost a decent quantity of their armed robots, at least for this specific company, and they lost a demolition robot, while another one was safe, relatively, with a few holes in it, having had returned behind the armor personnel carrier that before it moved up here, and their dismounts cleared this area of these two squads that were trying to fight them from between the buildings. Now, what happened here early on to this particular foxhole was, as all of this was going on over here and the shots were fired, completely destroying this demolition bot right after it planted its charges and tried to flee, right after that occurred, they were hit directly smack dab in the middle of their foxhole by a CH-901A loitering munition coming straight down upon them. And the heat warhead was, of course, powerful enough to do the job and destroyed the entire machine gun squad in here, as it was a squad built around a machine gun, of course, and a 240 Bravo, which was a general purpose machine gun, as they were put here for security reasons. And they're part of this battery here that was heavily hit by strafing attacks, airdropped and fired munitions from these Su-35s, as well as CH-901A loitering munitions going further off the map to hit the rest, including these here as well, moving off map, these three here. This one had hit these fleeing troops early on in conjunction with the strafing and the airdropped ordnance. This arrow right here is surrounded by both red and blue, hit by Russian and Chinese munitions simultaneously at the same time. And again, the carpet ordnance dropping here eliminated this entire battery. Although it was well spread out, it just couldn't withstand the sheer amount of munitions, the sheer tonnage that was just dropped over this long straight line, totally decimating it. Now, what had occurred over here with this company was that as they moved into the area after the line charge destroyed this machine gun emplacement of sandbags, and they eliminated this roving patrol that was practicing their standard operating procedures of their getting into a firing position and or patrolling the area within the vicinity for security purposes. This was all part of a large ongoing drill that was occurring. And these forces moved past the wooded area right here and right here. They moved up in between and on this side. And when the map segment was initially shown, they were right in these positions here, and they had eliminated this roving patrol and this machine gun nest. There was a machine gun nest here, but it was taken out by the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, dropping its massive payloads. And as that was occurring, YJ-18Cs or Club Ks, both were so similar, it could have been either or, flew over the area now that it was past 2 a.m. and different missile salvos were firing, starting at 2 and lasting until 10 a.m. in the morning, different salvos timed to fire at different times for the purposes of keeping missiles airborne for as long as possible from these specific systems. In addition to also having these salvos firing in different times in order for later salvos to have their targeting coordinates redirected as per the ISR assets finding new or changing targets. It was a twofold reason, essentially, for firing them in timed salvos, as the satellites could relay the new targeting data back to the containers that were firing the missiles, and henceforth send them to new targets or changed targets if something moved that needed to be struck. They already had their four-legged robots reconning the area ahead, as again, this was a 1 mile by 1.5 mile area. This was a fairly large, sizable area here. And over here, the platoon of this company here, with its headquarters platoon off the map, safely away from the combat, moving up here, as they were moving up here, this heavy strategic aircraft was already passing, so it was safe for them to move into this area after the munitions had already been dropped, already detonated. And as they were moving up, they called in for Russian air support from another pair of Su-35s as they were taking fire from this machine gun emplacement, this foxhole, as well as these berms, these earthen berms with 2 Max Pro MRAPs with M250 cal machine guns that were behind these berms, relatively safe from direct fire being fired by the vehicles. So, 2 Su-35s from the Su-35 squadron operating in the area of 12 total aircraft came in, strafed the area with their blasting 30mm ammunition, and dropped, each one dropping 2 FAB 500s or 1,000-pound munitions on this area. And they completely destroyed these 2 fortified emplacements, although they didn't get everyone in the foxhole. And the reason for that was because these earthen berms, when these munitions hit here and here, sort of dampened the blast a little bit. And because these guys were relatively lower, had a lower profile, and were technically mostly underground, except for when their heads protruded up above to fire, they were mostly still alive and fighting, although they were badly shooken up as these 4 different 1,000-pound munitions shook the ground like an earthquake. I mean, it was very intense, but adrenaline kept these guys fighting for their lives. So the next task that was undertaken by these combat engineers was to assign one of their demolition robots to handle the problem. Since the vehicle that had line charges had already used up their line charges with it needing to be essentially reloaded again, they sent their demolition robot instead with two of their armed robots covering it as they moved. One right here and the other right here moving up. And as this one right here got to here, it was laying down steady 12.7 millimeter fire, making them keep their heads down low, while this other one moved into place and did the exact same thing from here, interlocking fields of fire. By the time it got here and here, they were firing at them to make them keep their heads down, allowing for the whole platoon to move up with relative ease, although at times they were popping up and firing at the vehicles of the whole platoon that were now moving up in an orderly manner in a line before fanning out again. This platoon was moving up as well at the same time and was going to fan out, with this one fanning out upon reaching here, and do a large closing L-like sort of tactical maneuver, if you can call it that, with their vehicles, whereby instead of having to do that, the demolition robot was sent out from behind the armored engineering vehicle, the GPZ-111A, planted a C4 charge into the foxhole, basically dropping it in upon having gotten close. And although it was taking some fire from the rifles and light machine gun, it did manage to drop the charge into the foxhole before scampering behind their GPZ-111A armored engineering vehicle before detonating it inside the foxhole as soon as it got safely behind the vehicles. This took care of that issue, although this other platoon that arrived here was now taking heavy fire from all of these American forces that were up on the hills. There was a whole platoon of dismounted American troops that were part of the actual headquarters of headquarters battery of the 3rd of the 13th, who were on the other side of this specific hill in a campsite on the other side of it. And they had come over the hill and were now engaging these Chinese forces as they had no idea what was going on. And initially they were coming over as their communications failed them, as the 2H-6K heavy strategic bombers of the whole bomber squadron that were equipped with the KG-600s were jamming their radios at this point. They were trying to make contact with other elements of their battalion, as their other battery within their battalion that was stuck with the rest of the 75th getting destroyed by rocket artillery in the other battle was not arriving in the area, and also they didn't know what was necessarily going on with the other two batteries that were in the area here and here. They came over the hill ostensibly to make contact with them, and they were trying to reach these forces in these defensive positions that were taking part in the drills with the rest of the forces. And as they did that, they began to take fire from the Chi-Com forces, including from their armed robot here. And as it was well understood, as steady communications and the combat data links data were being transferred between all these forces, and they could see everything going on between what these forces were doing and what was going on between what other parts of their battalion were up to and what was going on with them, they understood that the other company that had performed and carried out the assault with them on the airfield itself had lost most of their armed robots and even one of their demolition robots. So they decided not to sacrifice another one, as this one here, upon reaching this area after the airstrikes had already occurred and the strafing attacks and the dropped munitions already occurred in this area right here, this armed robot went to recon ahead along with the reconnaissance quadcopter drones and discovered that these troops had come over the hill, but these troops completely destroyed this armed robot right here, as the green signifies around the arrow that it was destroyed by the time it got here. So instead of sacrificing another armed robot, they had it do a fighting retreat whereby it ran down this way, turned, fired, and then ran down and getting behind this platoon's vehicles. It all came up and lined up here initially before then reorienting themselves to fire at this group here. Instead of lining up facing to the west, they reoriented their vehicles and faced to the north, along with this spread out platoon that was already facing north. And they all oriented their fire, they all vectored their fire at the hill. And CH-901A loitering munitions were in the area, one of which attacked a squad of troops moving into the area here, as indicated by this completely surrounded green arrow in red, and destroyed them. While these troops were KIA'd, these five right here of this squad here. This squad had 9 men. Of this squad here, 5 were KIA'd by the armed robot and the vehicle fire, while the rest tried to flee. But they tried to do a tactical retreat, whereby these guys higher up on elevation continued to fire down. They vectored their fire down at these forces so that these guys could retreat, although it didn't make much of a difference because as these guys were retreating, they were still taking fire because the vehicles were just too powerful against these regular infantry, basically dismounts. They were essentially fighting like infantry forces. They were dismounted troops from the headquarters element, and although they were not combat troops per se, they were being used as infantry dismounts at this point. As originally, they didn't understand that there was even a full-scale invasion occurring, but now they had it literally thrust upon them as entering the area to try to make contact due to the downing of their communications, their satellites, their internet. They had no other choice. By this point, all messages had to be relayed by foot or by ATV, like the Gator ATVs the Army loves so much, or by vehicle-based transit of personnel to spread messages. So being that the campsite for the headquarters battery was over, the headquarters and support battery rather, was over the hill, they had to come down to try to establish contact. And they heard the enormous blasting of all these munitions too. So by the time they came over, they already had an idea of what was generally occurring. And this was before the missiles began to come in and target the other forces of their specific element, their headquarters and support battery of the whole battalion. Because already a tactical ballistic missile destroyed this specific headquarters platoon of this specific firing battery, with the heavy strategic bomber coming in and dropping all this. These guys had come over right as this was coming to an end. These guys literally had come over, and they witnessed a little bit of it, but they heard it first as right before they came over the crescent or the crest of the hill. They heard the pounding of these munitions blasting this firing battery into oblivion. So they had to figure out what was going on in order to try to make contact with anybody that they could, as well as spread information back, as this was a sort of recon operation to spread the information back to the rest of the headquarters and support battery over the battalion. So these forces were taking heavy fire, and they were forced to retreat. So they did a sort of tactical type retreat where they laid down fire and they ran back, then they would lay down fire while they ran back, then they would lay down fire. They would do it 2 squads lay fire while 2 run back, then they would stop, turn around, lay down fire while the other 2 squads came back, and they would do it like that. But they really didn't get a good opportunity to do that because the vehicle-based firepower from these combat engineers was simply too powerful, and they couldn't withstand that and the loitering munitions coming in, as well as airstrikes that would come back, including strafing and fired and dropped munitions from Su-35 aircraft. The heavy strategic bomber, in addition to this one that was off-map, was already a bit further away by a few miles, dropping its payload on a different unit, on the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade that was a guest unit here to train with the 75th. There were so many different activities going on, as this was a very large post, a very large installation, and a lot of spread out forces being engaged now by a lot of artillery, a lot of air-based munitions, and a lot of ground forces as well. And this included, of course, artillery, and it included heavy strategic aircraft in the form of the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft. It included ground attack aircraft, strike aircraft. They could also perform close air support like these Su-35s, and there was also an Su-34 squadron operating in the area, and even a Chinese J-11 fighter squadron that was initially here for combat air patrols and for air superiority missions, as they were mostly armed with air-to-air munitions like the PL-12 air-to-air missiles, which were fairly long range, 62-mile range, as well as the longest range air-to-air missile in the world, which is the PL-15, which had an exceedingly long range of nearly 200 miles. So as all of this was occurring, there was a lot of activity going on all over the map. But when it all came down to it, the PLA engineers of these 2 companies, and this was only 2 companies in this operation, that's all that was here was 2 companies, with the rest of the battalion off the map, with the other 5 combat companies moving north toward the perimeter of the installation, just off the map, with the headquarters company off the map behind these 2 companies that were doing a recon and force into the area, which erupted into full-scale fighting and full-scale battle against these forces holding the area. As their reconnaissance, their ISR assets, including their quadcopter recon drones that they sent ahead of them to scout the area, including the WZ-7s, including even aircraft that overflew the area, all found their targets and decimated them. And they did it rather quickly as well, because it was intelligence reports had already ascertained where all the major units were operating throughout the installation, although due to shifting of different units at different times, due to the training that was underway, they had to constantly maintain their eyes on the situation as far as their ISR assets. They had to be able to pinpoint exactly where every unit and subunit was at any given moment. And that included the forces that were arrayed around the airfield. It included the forces on the other side of this hill and other parts of the training ranges. It included the entire installation. They had to know where every unit and subunit was at any given moment in order to accurately target it, including like using this DF-15B to accurately destroy and turn this into a crater, which was their former campsite. They had to know, because they could have packed up and moved, but because they were still here and their reconnaissance drones seen them still in this area, they were able to relay that targeting data all the way to the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, which was itself a Trojan unit deep in East Texas, able to fire at this target here with extreme accuracy, including even the targets selected by the container-based supersonic YJ-18C or Russian-made caliber cruise missiles that were fired, 4 apiece out of each container. So targeting data was constantly updated, and even if a target didn't change location, it still had to have eyes on at all times. There had to be a full, complete understanding of where everything was at any given moment. Even if those targets didn't move, they still had to have eyes on, just in case. It was standard operating procedure. So these 2 companies took the field by the end of the battle. They had totally smashed these last 2 firing batteries, as the other firing battery was destroyed by artillery fire itself from the multiple launch rocket systems of the PHL-11 122mm rocket batteries comprising the 2 PHL-11 battalions within the 77th Artillery Brigade of the 77th Group Army. Even the vehicles that made it out of the first massive artillery barrage of those rockets in that specific area were hit in turn by loitering munitions, ground-based fire from the combat engineers and their vehicles, or by airstrikes from the J-11s called in for close air support when they were ambushing the 100th Brigade Support Battalion of the whole 75th Field Artillery Brigade of the Americans. And the Chinese called in for close air support from their fighter jets, who were initially tasked with air superiority operations, but did have a small amount of ground munitions equipped for specifically close air support missions, just in case they were required for such. And they struck their targets with great precision and destroyed them. As destroying these firing batteries that comprise these battalions of the 75th Field Artillery Brigade was the second highest priority of the forces involved of the coalition in this specific battle, as the first priority had been destroying the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, as that had the longest range air defense systems within the facility, as of course there were also SHORAD systems, but the SHORAD systems didn't matter nearly as much as the Patriot systems did, as destroying those was the highest priority given the fact that they had the longest range and altitude reach in terms of the American air defenses in the installation, while the SHORAD systems could only hit very close targets like helicopters, and within the area that the helicopters were going to be operating in was nowhere near where the SHORAD assets were of the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade, which had the 4th of the 60th, which itself was a short-range air defense artillery battalion. And it was equipped with the new SHORAD IMs, which replaced the older Avenger systems. But those weren't anywhere near the main installation where the Chinese planned to use their transport helicopters to drop off their special operations forces, and therefore the engineers could take their time in dealing with that, as the airstrikes and attacks from the ground by the combat engineers would nullify that specific threat slightly later after this battle occurred. As these headquarters troops, acting as infantry forces now, as dismounts infantry that were originally going to make contact right as the air raid started and the ground combat began, they were wiped out as they fled the area, as they were pursued by CH-901A loitering munitions and were hit by follow-up strikes from Su-35 or Su-34 strike aircraft operating in the area, in addition to the engineers firing their fairly long-ranged weaponry from their infantry fighting vehicles at them, basically the 35mm Gatling autocannon, which was a massive round, as well as their HJ-73C anti-tank guided missiles, as well as their small arms, as well as their 12.7mm heavy machine guns on their vehicles. And their armed robot that survived was going to be taken back to the headquarters battalion for repairs, as the 77th Engineering Brigade's entire headquarters battalion had dedicated maintenance elements, including for their demolition and armed robots. And it was full of holes and in bad need of repair, as it had gotten into a massive firefight with these forces as they had been coming over the hill. But the area was successfully secured, the objectives were achieved, and the headquarters battery was now beginning to be pummeled by various cruise missiles and even new volleys of tactical ballistic missiles fired to hit them over this hill, as it was initially priority one, at least for the time being early on, to hit these batteries and destroy all their components, including their headquarters units, as these buildings were thoroughly cleared, this one being completely demolished, this one being thoroughly cleared, and this campsite being completely destroyed by a tactical ballistic missile, with airstrikes destroying this battery and a strategic air raid destroying this battery. The 3rd of the 13th officially ceased being a unit on the map. It was completely destroyed. And the combat engineers, with very few casualties, took full control over the airfield and had a great success at this particular battle. Although the fighting wasn't anywhere near being completely over yet, as there was still more units that needed to be contended with on this larger battlefield here at Fort Sill, as well as many other battles going on throughout the entire South Central Invasion Sector campaign that would even last 2 entire days. Although many battles didn't last nearly as long and were over rapidly within a matter of hours, including this battle at Fort Sill, although this lasted longer than did the battle at the Sherman Air Force, or the Shepherd Air Force Base and Wichita Falls battle going on just to the south, being conducted by the same exact group army, although with its different other components handling that specific operation. As the combat wrapped up in this sector, as the 2 companies and headquarters companies came in through the south and the other 5 combat engineering combat companies moved up this way along this route here, as you see the line of contact bends, they were about to engage next the Shorad Battalion, the 4th of the 60th, as well as the 4th of the 1st, which was an artillery battalion with M109A6 Paladin artillery pieces, 155 millimeter. And that, of course, would be followed up by them striking again, but this time to the southwest, to deal with additional elements of the 1st Armored Division's Artillery Brigade, or their Divisional Artillery Brigade, as well as the fighting going on here still raging by 2:30, although it was starting to die out somewhat. And after the fighting had concluded in this specific area of the battle space, these 2 battalions, the armored and the mechanized infantry, and this additional mechanized infantry battalion that surrounded and destroyed the 5th of the 5th here, moved to cut off lines of retreat, as well as to strike deep into the main part of the installation to finish off essentially what was left being training units, military police, and trainees, new recruits, cadets, if you will, on the main installation. Heavy strategic bomber aircraft had already leveled much of the main installation, in addition to tactical ground strike operations carried out by this squadron of Su-34 strike aircraft, called in for close air support similar to the Su-35 squadron, or carrying out their own tactical ground strikes that were preordained by intelligence already gathered upon the installation and utilized in the attack plan. In the next video in this sub-series of this documentary will be the fighting that occurred in the motor pool area and northwest portion of the main installation, mostly against training elements of this TRADOC post, or this post being a training center essentially for different MOSs, primarily 13 Bravos, which are your field artillery cannoneers, but also air defense artillery, as there is an air defense artillery school, as well as other types of MOSs and AITs, or advanced individual training. between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m., with the roadbound forces of the Special Operations Forces arriving by 4 a.m., with the 40th and 150th Mountain Combined Arms Brigades arriving at the battle's end, literally, at 7 a.m., more forces, essentially reinforcements, would be moving into the area, including the combat rotary aircraft of the 77th Aviation Brigade, including its 2 armed reconnaissance helicopter battalions and its 2 attack helicopter battalions, which would be supporting ground operations carried out by the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, as well as Special Operations Forces acting in this area as well.